The reels were catalogued as federal emergency broadcast test material, but the first problem was visible before any restoration began. Several leader strips named counties that do not exist in any state registry, and one reel carried the same identifier twice with two different dates. I opened the transfer under the assumption that the archive had been careless. That was not what the materials showed. The anomaly was specific, repeated, and already present in the paperwork before anyone touched playback. The cans themselves were ordinary decommissioned studio stock, 35mm broadcast reels in metal storage cans with oxidized rims and dried tape residue on the lids. One had a faded station sticker under the federal tag, but the call letters had been blacked out by hand so long ago that the ink had bled into the paper. The intake sheet described tone bars, slate cards, and standard continuity slugs. It did not mention geography. Yet the first inspection note already contained place names that could not be matched to any map, atlas, or jurisdictional index in the file. The first restoration pass found a brief landscape insertion at the edge of the leader. It lasted less than a second. The image showed a low river under a flat sky with no road, no buildings, and no horizon marker that could anchor the frame to known terrain. On the next slate frame, a county name appeared in plain type. It had the look of a routine broadcast card. The name itself had no record. One technician wrote, "Possible splice damage." The same note then treated the county name as if it had been verified by station staff. It had not. I checked the associated audio logs next. The first clean track held a standard emergency tone, then a male voice reading a county advisory in the exact cadence used by broadcast continuity tests. The line was brief and controlled. It named a place that did not exist in the federal or state records we checked. Another fragment referred to a river district with no postal entry and no civil equivalent. The voice sounded trained, local, and entirely routine. Its content did not belong to any known jurisdiction. By the end of the day, the transfer had been moved from disposal to restricted review. Nothing about the physical film suggested ordinary damage. There was no burn, no vinegar odor, no obvious emulsion failure. Yet, the frame reports showed the same kind of insertion on more than one reel, each image arriving at nearly the same point in the slug sequence. One frame held a dry floodplain with utility poles standing in water that reached their cross arms. Another showed what might have been a courthouse square, except the building fronts looked unfinished, as if the image had been captured before the place was complete. The point at which the case changed was not dramatic. It was procedural. The county names reappeared across reels that were supposed to hold separate test sessions. The same names surfaced in different audio takes, sometimes with slight timing shifts, as if the script had been revised after recording and before duplication. One transcript page used the phrase jurisdictional continuity in a context that only made sense if those counties had been recognized by the agency. They were not. The page had the correct studio header, but the date line had been altered by hand until the original number could not be read. The first report ended with a routine recommendation for further comparison. The second, issued the next morning, advised that the reels remain in analog isolation until source verification was complete. In the margin beneath that instruction, someone had written a county name again, followed by a note. Not in Atlas, not in records, still in track 3. That line is why the file reached me. It suggested that the anomaly was stable enough to survive more than one medium, and that it had already begun to persist outside the original reel. The material had names, sequence, and enough internal consistency to resist correction. Before deeper restoration began, the archive already held a signal pattern that referred to places no jurisdiction owned and no map could locate. The first credible evidence came from the restoration bench rather than the intake room. The reels were sent to the analog lab because the leader markings did not agree and the audio needed isolation before further cataloging. The initial handling was normal. The cans were cleaned, the stock was wound onto inspection cores, and the splices were checked for decay. Nothing in that process suggested more than poor storage. The irregularity appeared when frame review was slowed over the slate segment on the first reel. At normal speed, the footage looked like standard broadcast filler, tone bars, a slate card, and a studio test screen. On pause and step review, one frame at the edge of the leader contained the landscape insertion that did not belong there. It showed a low river under a pale sky, with dead grass on the bank and survey stakes driven in pairs along the edge. No road entered the frame. No structures did. The image was present for one frame only, then returned to the slate. The technician marked it as possible splice contamination and moved on. The second reel produced another insertion in a different position, but with the same visual character. This one showed a drainage plane, nearly flat, with a narrow channel cutting through black mud. A wooden sign stood far in the distance. When enlarged, the sign carried a county name that did not exist in any state registry or federal jurisdictional record we checked. The same name returned in the audio a few seconds later, spoken in the measured emergency cadence used by continuity tests. A note from the bench log captured the shift in tone. Audio clean. Advisory copy references Black Fork County. No record found. The line was underlined twice. In the same log, the engineer added that the voice sounded as if it had been recorded in the station booth, not built from archive stock. That mattered because the reels were supposed to contain only federal test material and canned continuity segments. They did not contain a live booth read, or rather, the first pass suggested they did not. The county names kept appearing in different forms. Some were spoken as if they had been part of an original script. Others were visible only as burned in text on frames that should have held blank leader. One reel carried the phrase, "Welcome to Great Hollow Parish," on a title card that showed no obvious signs of tampering. Another had a road advisory mentioning a river district with no counterpart in any road atlas or postal index the studio held. I checked the cross-references myself. then had them checked again against state survey maps, census records, and old Federal Emergency Service directories. Nothing matched. The names were absent, not obsolete. A small physical irregularity proved the footage was not merely mislabeled. On Reel 3, the frame counter on the transfer report skipped 2 numbers during normal playback, then recovered without a visible dropout. When the segment was examined again in frame advance, the missing interval contained a roadside marker beside floodwater. On the first inspection, it had no text. On the second, the same frame showed a stencil reading "County Boundary" beneath the rust streaks. There was no corresponding cut in the reel and no sound edit at that point. 3 technicians documented the discrepancy. None of them called it a hallucination. The restoration team then began a formal comparison between the real content and the station's surviving broadcast paperwork. That comparison made the case harder to dismiss. The studio schedules listed the reels as Federal Emergency Broadcast Continuity Tests, circulated over several months and never aired. The paperwork did not mention county advisories, yet the audio tracks contained advisory language that fit the emergency format exactly, including standard phrasing for shelter, road closure, and local broadcast interruption. The place names were the only part that failed. One engineer found a line that read, "Residents of Hollow Parish should remain clear of the South Channel until further notice." The parish did not appear in any civil or diocesan record under that name. The lab next tried to identify whether the anomaly came from the film stock, the playback machine, or the optical capture chain. That should have produced a mechanical answer. Instead, the problem shifted. A later scan of Reel 1 produced a different frame sequence at the same point where the river landscape had first appeared. The frame was no longer a riverbank. It showed an unfinished intersection with a signpost and a concrete foundation trench. The technician who had seen the riverbank during the first pass insisted the original image had been real. The scan record supported both claims and neither. There was no damage line, no emulsion lift, and no sign of replacement. One internal note used language that should not have existed in that context. Prior review confirms jurisdictional voice insertion at 3:12. There had been no prior review session logged at 3:12. The day sheet contained no such entry. The engineer who wrote the note denied writing it when questioned, then recognized the phrasing as her own after being shown the page. Her revised statement was shorter. She said the session had not happened while she was awake. That line was removed from the official summary, but preserved in the margin copy. By then, the material had built a pattern that was hard to ignore. Each reel produced 1 or more landscape inserts, always brief, always at points that should have held standard slates or blank leader. The places were similar but not identical. A mud flat, a drainage ditch, a courthouse foundation. A road cut under heavy cloud, a field with utility poles set in water. None could be matched to a known county, though the same county names continued to appear in the audio. The geographic references were stable enough to repeat and too specific to dismiss as random noise. The first direct compromise came through audio isolation. During one cleaned transfer, a standard end tone was followed, not by the expected station identifier, but by a soft click, then by a second tone sequence that matched the original cadence exactly, while shifting the frequency profile by a small margin the lab rarely used. It was the kind of variation a station would test once and archive if it ever deployed it. The station records showed no such deployment. Yet, the variation appeared in the reel and then, on a later pass, in two other reels that had not originally contained it. The copy did not seem to move in the ordinary direction of duplication. It seemed to propagate. The engineer wrote a brief entry after that discovery. Tone variant, not in schedule. Source, not external. She underlined the last word. When asked what she meant, she said only that the variant had shown up after the reel was rewound, not after it had been copied. That distinction became important within hours. Telephone calls began that same afternoon. At first, the calls were treated as nuisance traffic. The restoration suite had a monitored line because the lab still maintained contact with station archives and emergency broadcast contacts in case of transfer issues. The calls were logged automatically. There was no audible voice on the line, only the station's own sign-off tone, repeated with the same cadence found on the reels. The tone was not generic. It matched the archived station profile down to the interval between the closing note and the carrier fade. The switchboard operator flagged the first 3 calls as likely prank traffic. The 4th was placed directly to the engineer's desk. She heard it herself and documented it before the lab staff could dispute the account. Her note read, "Incoming call," same sign-off pattern as reel 3, no caller voice, no static. She added that the line had been idle between calls and that the phone indicator showed an incoming number field, though no number resolved. The field displayed the station identifier that had once belonged to the decommissioned regional broadcaster, the one whose archive had produced the reels. That identifier had been retired decades earlier. The same identifier appeared on the restoration logs the next morning, but only in the copies stored on the lab workstation. The printed logs did not contain it. The workstation copy listed a call at the exact time the phone rang, followed by a review reference no one on staff remembered authoring. The line read, "Playback confirmed on second pass." There had been no second pass completed before the call, only a paused inspection. The archive printout from the same period showed no such note. The digital file did. By that point, the team was checking whether the system clock or annotation software had failed. That inquiry did not help. The timestamps in the digital record were internally consistent, but they no longer matched the physical media schedule. A reel logged as reviewed at 9:30 in the morning was later listed as having undergone a second pass at 2:17 p.m., with the note describing a county advisory that had not been isolated when the reel was first touched. The sequence was impossible in a strict procedural sense, and yet it persisted across copies. The most unsettling evidence came from the frame index sheets. A segment that had been blank during the first survey now contained a low-contrast image of a radio mast in full, with a service road below it, and what looked like a county marker leaning into the ditch. The marker had not been present the first time the segment was inspected. The next segment held a clean black frame with caption text over it. The caption did not identify a broadcast test. It identified a location. The location did not exist. The team reran the same reel 3 times. Each run produced the same sequence of events in a slightly different order. The audio advisory moved 1 frame earlier on one pass, then returned to its original location on the next. The landscape insertion changed from riverbank to road cut and then back again. The phone calls continued. No voice answered them. Only the sign off a tone played, followed by the short station tail that the old transmitter used at closure. The recorded calls were identical, except for one detail. On the final call of the night, the tone held a fraction longer before the line dropped. That extra hold matched a variation listed in a draft broadcast sheet the lab had never been given. I reviewed the draft sheet myself. It had been inserted into the station documentation packet between 2 pages that had been signed out years earlier. The packet had no record of a new insertion, but the paper was aged and yellowed like the rest. The draft sheet contained the same county names heard on the reels. It also contained a list of call signs for stations that had gone dark before the regional broadcaster closed. One of those call signs appeared in the phone log the next morning as an incoming missed call. The line had never existed in the active telephone system, according to the provider archive. The provider archive had no explanation for the entry, only a blank where the assignment should have been. By then, the restoration engineer had stopped treating the problem as a simple contamination issue. Her later notes became more specific and more restrained. She wrote that the reels did not always preserve the same content from one review to the next. She wrote that the material behaved as if access itself altered it. She wrote, after a long blank space, "If this is only footage, it should not know the phone number." That sentence was the last clean statement in the log before the final escalation. The next page was a partial printout of frame hashes, most of them repeated, some overwritten by hand in a way that suggested a later correction. In the margin, someone had added, "Do not call back." The ink was different. The handwriting was not. The materials had already crossed from anomaly into contamination by then. The evidence did not simply describe the reels. It began to absorb the surrounding record. The calls, the schedules, the copied notes, and the frame hashes no longer agreed on which version of the footage had come first. A broadcast test was no longer just being examined. It was leaving traces in the process of examination. The final page in the folder for that section contained only a brief engineering status line and one damaged waveform strip. The status line read, "Tone profile matches archived sign off with unlisted cadence." Beneath it, in a hand I could not verify, was a county name that had already appeared in the audio. The waveform strip itself had a notch cut into the center, as if a single syllable had been removed and then replaced by silence. When enlarged, the silence was not empty. It showed a faint frame border, as if the sound file had briefly remembered how to be film. That was the last point at which the restoration team still had a normal distinction between source material and observation. After that, the logs began referring to review sessions that had not yet occurred, and the phone calls started arriving with station identifiers that had been retired before the studio closed. The section ends there in the file I was given, with the first stable proof that the reels were not merely mislabeled, and with the more troubling possibility that the system around them had already begun to answer. The next set of materials showed that the anomaly had stopped behaving like a single corrupted passage and had begun to spread across the restoration record itself. The first sign was not visual. It was a note appended to a routine scan report that referred to a second pass that had never taken place. The note read, in part, second pass. There had been no second pass completed before the call, only a paused inspection. The archive printout from the same period showed no such note. The digital file did. That discrepancy led the team back to the timestamps, but the checks only deepened the problem. The digital record stayed internally consistent, while the physical media schedule drifted away from it. A reel logged as reviewed at 9:30 in the morning was later listed as having undergone a second pass at 2:17 p.m., with a note describing a county advisory that had not been isolated when the reel was first touched. The sequence should have been impossible. It remained in the record anyway. The most unsettling evidence came from the frame index sheets. A segment that had been blank during the first survey now contained a low-contrast image of a radio mast in fog, with a service road below it and a county marker leaning into the ditch. The marker had not been present the first time the segment was inspected. The next segment held a clean black frame with caption text over it. The caption did not identify a broadcast test. It identified a location. The location did not exist. The team reran the same reel 3 times. Each run produced the same sequence of events in a slightly different order. The audio advisory moved 1 frame earlier on one pass, then returned to its original location on the next. The landscape insertion changed from riverbank to road cut, and then back again. The phone calls continued. No voice answered them. Only the sign off tone played, followed by the short station tail that the old transmitter used at closure. The recorded calls were identical, except for one detail. On the final call of the night, the tone held a fraction longer before the line dropped. That extra hold matched a variation listed in a draft broadcast sheet the lab had never been given. I reviewed the draft sheet myself. It had been inserted into the station documentation packet between 2 pages that had been signed out years earlier. The packet had no record of a new insertion, but the paper was aged and yellowed like the rest. The draft sheet contained the same county names heard on the reels. It also contained a list of call signs for stations that had gone dark before the regional broadcaster closed. One of those call signs appeared in the phone log the next morning as an incoming missed call. The line had never existed in the active telephone system, according to the provider archive. The provider archive had no explanation for the entry, only a blank where the assignment should have been. By then, the restoration engineer had stopped treating the problem as a simple contamination issue. Her later notes became more specific and more restrained. She wrote that the reels did not always preserve the same content from one review to the next. She wrote that the material behaved as if Access itself altered it. She wrote after a long blank space, "If this is only footage, it should not know the phone number." That sentence was the last clean statement in the log before the final escalation. The next page was a partial printout of frame hashes, most of them repeated, some overwritten by hand in a way that suggested a later correction. In the margins, someone had added "do not call back." The ink was different. The handwriting was not. The materials had already crossed from anomaly into contamination by then. The evidence did not simply describe the reels, it began to absorb the surrounding record. The calls, the schedules, the copied notes, and the frame hashes no longer agreed on which version of the footage had come first. A broadcast test was no longer just being examined. It was leaving traces in the process of examination. The final page in the folder for that section contained only a brief engineering status line and one damaged waveform strip. The status line read, "Tone profile matches archived sign-off with unlisted cadence." Beneath it, in a hand I could not verify, was a county name that had already appeared in the audio. The waveform strip itself had a notch cut into the center, as if a single syllable had been removed and then replaced by silence. When enlarged, the silence was not empty. It showed a faint frame border, as if the sound file had briefly remembered how to be film. That was the last point at which the restoration team still had a normal distinction between source material and observation. After that, the logs began referring to review sessions that had not yet occurred, and the phone calls started arriving with station identifiers that had been retired before the studio closed. The section ends there in the file I was given, with the first stable proof that the reels were not merely mislabeled, and with the more troubling possibility that the system around them had already begun to answer. The later packet removed any remaining doubt that the record itself had been touched. By the time I reached it, the engineer's notes and the phone logs were agreeing with each other in a way that no normal archive should allow. The calls had become more precise, and the material had become less stable. A reel that had previously held a single inserted landscape now carried that same landscape across two review states, each with a different audio bed. The change was not presented as a correction. It appeared as if the reel had revised itself between one check and the next. The restoration team noted the shift after a routine checksum comparison. One frame sequence from the first reel no longer matched the earlier capture copy, even though the physical can had not been opened again. The difference was small in isolation. A roadside marker was visible in one version and absent in another. The marker bore a county designation that no one in the lab could place. More troubling was the fact that the second version contained a strip of road, a drainage ditch, and a line of power poles that had never been in the first scan. The grain was consistent with the stock. The geography was not consistent with any chart they consulted. The engineer began annotating the discrepancies in a narrower hand. She stopped writing about contamination and started writing about revision. One note read, "Frame contents are not fixed after first playback." Another, added later and squeezed into the lower margin, read, "Audio may be following the image." The phrasing was controlled. That made it worse. The source material did not simply contain anomalies. It appeared to sequence them. The next reel made the problem harder to separate from ordinary failure. It carried a standard emergency slate, then a black interval, then a county advisory over what should have been dead air. During the first pass, the advisory was partly obscured by a burst of static and a low tone that the lab identified as a standard station calibration artifact. On a later pass, the same advisory was clear. The static had shifted to the tail end of the clip, and the low tone had become a second voice, thin and almost identical to the primary announcer. Only the cadence differed. The lab could not isolate that second voice in the original capture. It was present in the restoration output anyway. A short note in the sound report captured the disturbance better than the longer commentary. No source channel for secondary cadence. That line was followed by a blank and then a frequency printout that had been marked with a pencil circle. The circled band matched the archived station sign off profile to within a fraction the analyst called negligible. He then added that the same band did not exist in the live monitoring capture taken during playback. In other words, the tone was present in the recording, absent in the room, and still sufficient to trigger the station's own verification routine. That verification routine soon became part of the problem. The station archive contained legacy identifiers for emergency closures, some of them long retired. When the team cross-checked the identifiers against the telephone logs, they found that the inbound calls had begun to map to those same old station codes. The call trace sheet showed numbers that were not allocated to any current service, and in several cases no longer to any service at all. One of the numbers had been disconnected before the studio converted to digital operation. Yet it appeared 3 times in the log, each time accompanied by the same sign-off tone and the same short pause before disconnect. The pause mattered. It matched the extra hold heard on the final call from the previous day, and then it showed up again in a different reel's audio tail. The team had not cataloged that hold as a separate event before. Once they did, it recurred across multiple files, always at the end of a broadcast closure, always at the point where the transmitter would normally have cut to silence. The effect was subtle enough that I understand why it was missed at first, but once isolated, it became difficult to ignore. The reel seemed to know where the station ended, even when the station was no longer live. The engineer's phone log became the most consequential record in the folder. She had been receiving the calls at irregular intervals, never answering, only documenting. At first, there was nothing to distinguish them from the earlier calls already noted in the restoration room. Then one entry included a station identifier in the caller field, not a number. The identifier belonged to a relay site that had been closed and demolished years before the regional broadcaster shut down. The same identifier appeared in a handwritten equipment roster from a different box, one that had not yet been opened when the roster was supposedly filed. I checked the roster against the archive intake chain. The page should not have been there. The folder sequence did not allow it, yet the paper was folded into the packet at the exact point where the later notes began. The roster had 3 items highlighted in the same pale yellow ink used on the county names from the reels. Next to one of those items, someone had written a single word: return. That word repeated in another form on the next reel. In the restored audio, under the advisory, a secondary voice briefly said, "Return to County Line 6. There is no County Line 6 in the relevant jurisdictional records, and no county with the name recorded beside it." The phrase should have been meaningless. Instead, it appeared in 2 separate logs and in a service memo stamped after the engineer's last verified review session. The memo described a monitoring event she had not reported. It used her initials. At that point, the distinction between a damaged reel and a compromised record began to collapse. The restoration software started generating frame references that had no corresponding source index. One report cited a black frame at a time code that did not exist on the physical leader. Another noted an image of a water tower with the county seal painted over in fresh white. The engineer wrote that she had not seen the tower on the first pass. She also wrote that the station database now contained a closure notice dated the day after the file was processed, though the closure had happened decades earlier. That notice is important because it was not in the system when I first inspected the archive transfer. I verified that against my own intake copy. The later version appears only in the digital record. The text is plain enough. It announces deactivation of a transmitter site and lists an emergency test interval for the following week, a week that had already passed. The dates do not align with the physical reels, and the file history does not support an edit at that level. Yet, the notice is present in the compiled record, and it references the same call sign that later appears in the phone trace from the engineer's desk line. The final materials from that review window are the most difficult to reconcile. They include a reel that was initially labeled as a continuity test, then relabeled in pencil, then logged again under a station identifier rather than a real number. During restoration, the reel produced a sequence of frames that did not remain fixed between captures. In one review, the frame after the slate showed a maintenance yard. In another, it showed a county road cut with no structures at all. In the third, the same frame contained a broadcast tower standing in floodwater, though the audio on that pass carried a dry, clean station tone with no evidence of environmental noise. The lab attempted to freeze the image at the point of variation. The resulting still showed a broadcast console reflected in a dark surface that was not in the original shot. The reflection contained an illuminated tally lamp marked in a format the station had not used for years. More troubling, the console did not belong to the studio where the reels had been recovered. It matched the configuration of a smaller relay room that had been removed from service and erased from inventory before the studio closure. According to the facility papers, that room should not have existed anywhere in the chain. A final note from the engineer describes the last successful comparison. She wrote that the reel's audio and the phone log had finally converged. The incoming call at 2:14 a.m. matched the broadcast sign-off tone exactly, including the unlisted cadence variation first seen on the draft sheet. The call trace identified the source as a dead station line. The reel itself, when played back from the marked position, contained the same tone, and beneath it, a voice that said only the station identifier. She did not add commentary after that line. The log ends with a paper note scanned into the file. It reads, "This is not a playback." That was the point at which the documentation became vulnerable, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied about access. If the material was not playback, then the archive had been handling an active signal and not a dead record. The difference matters. It changes the meaning of every prior review session, including those I had assumed were complete. It also explains why later annotations refer to earlier checks that were not in the physical archive but do exist in the digital reconstruction, with timestamps that drift by minutes around the same call events and the same county names. The last usable page in the packet is a signal verification sheet with half its lower edge torn away. It lists one of the defunct station identifiers and a status entry written in capital letters. The entry says only, "Open carrier confirmed." Beneath it, in a different hand, is the phrase, "Do not answer after sign-off." The phrase is underlined twice. In the blank space below that, there is a small indentation where a phone number appears to have been pressed into the paper and later erased. I retained the surviving reel indexes, the call trace copies, and the restoration notes, but the lab stopped all further playback pending sealed review. The materials were transferred into restricted classification with the rest of the broadcast intake. I do not consider that restriction complete. The phone log continued to show incoming attempts from retired station identifiers after the reels were boxed. The final reel still carried a live tone profile in the verification file. I could not confirm whether the source was the film, the archive, or a transmitter no one had located. The surviving facts are narrower than the file suggests. The reels were labeled as Federal Emergency Test Material. They contained county names that do not exist in any known record. They also contained landscape inserts that changed between review passes, audio advisories with stable cadence and unstable geography, and sign-off tones that matched the decommissioned station exactly, including an unlisted cadence variation. The engineer's notes began to reference events that had not yet been logged. The digital record followed suit. The printed record did not. There is one detail I did not have room to dismiss. On the last complete verification sheet, the status line read, "Open carrier confirmed." That was not my wording. It appeared after the final call from the engineer's desk line and before the playback lock was applied. The same sheet carried the instruction not to answer after sign off. The note was underlined twice. The paper beneath it held a shallow pressure mark where a number had been pressed in and then erased. I checked the studio records against the call trace one more time before closing the file. The results did not improve. The retired identifiers still appeared as incoming calls, though no active subscriber lines were attached to them. One of the identifiers belonged to a relay site that had been demolished years earlier. Another matched a station code removed from service before the studio conversion. The final reel remained indexed as a recording, but the last review notes do not describe it that way. They describe a signal that continued past the end of the frame. The materials are now sealed, and further playback has been denied. That is the formal status. It does not answer the larger question. The anomaly has not been located in a single reel, a single machine, or a single record set. It appears in the film, in the copied logs, and in the telephone traffic that followed the restoration work. If the source was ever confined to the archive, that confinement did not hold. The last thing I can log is the narrowest and least comfortable fact in the file. The final reel still produced carrier when the lab stopped listening. That does not prove the signal remains active. It only shows that at the moment access ended, something on the line had not yet gone silent. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.